On behalf of the Naval Institute and AFCEA International, welcome to West 2016. It's my honor to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, who's been a friend and with whom I served and had the privilege to serve in the Navy for over 30 years. Admiral James Stavridis became the 12th leader of the prestigious Fletcher School right after his retirement in 2013. He did so after 37 years of service to the Navy and to the nation. As a four-star, he led the NATO alliance in all operations from 2009 to 2013 as the Supreme Allied Commander. Prior to that, he served as the Southern Command Commander with responsibility for all military operations in Latin America. A Fletcher PhD, a winner of the Gullion Prize in 1983 for Outstanding Student, he has published 6 books and over 100 articles, and his 2012 TED Talk has over 700,000 hits. His focus is on innovation, strategic communication and planning, and creating security through international, interagency, and public-private partnerships in this turbulent 21st century. We at the Naval Institute are very proud to count him as the chair of our board of directors. Let's give a very warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Admiral James Stavridis.
Thanks, Pete. Wonderful. Thank you. Good morning. I was reminded in that slightly awkward pause as we were waiting for the national anthem music to start. About 20 years ago, I was on the waterfront in San Diego, and I went to a change of command on a Spruance-class destroyer where the same thing happened. And much like Vice Admiral Twig Branch, the executive officer of that destroyer, who was, of course, the master of ceremonies, felt, okay, I can do this, and he a cappellaed the national anthem personally. The bad news was, halfway through, he forgot the words. It was a bad morning on the Spruance. Pete, thanks for that wonderful, wonderful introduction. It's terrific to be in San Diego. I now, as was mentioned, am the dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in Boston, where it is very cold and icy. So delightful to be here with so many friends and colleagues from different parts of my life and career. And I'm joined by my lovely wife, Laura, so that's a pleasure as well. Normally, when people hear that introduction, you know, the Supreme Allied Commander and whatnot, they tend to say two things right away. First, they say, you know, I thought he would be taller than he appears to be. And the second thing they say is, well, you know, Stavridis, if you're really that cool, why were you not a naval aviator? You know, because obviously I was a surface officer. And the answer is, at one time, I desperately wanted to be a naval aviator. And I thought that could be part of my life. But unfortunately, I had a very traumatic experience when I was a young boy that made aviation very, very difficult for me. And I'm going to try to get this slide to advance. Okay. There it is. Realizing I couldn't be a naval aviator, I thought, well, maybe what I can do is be a submariner, because, you know, submariners are really smart, and I know there's a lot of submariners here. I just saw Joe Malloy do this kind of stream of consciousness riff on the budget this morning. He sounded like James Joyce unspooling A Portrait of the Artist as a young man. But I realized I needed some practice to become a naval aviator, a submariner, and so I went on midshipman cruise on a submarine to kind of test out my skills in the submarine world. And unfortunately, they gave me the con as we were pulling into a Mediterranean port, and it really didn't go very well either. So I decided what I needed was to be a surface officer, and there it is. And I'm proud of being a surface officer, and I'll try and bring some of that sensibility today as I talk about our world. And what I'd like to do in about half an hour is walk you through some of the challenges we're collectively facing today, and then spark some discussion that I hope will flow through this conference about what we ought to do about it. We're going to begin by kind of scanning the horizon, and I'll start with the photograph image that I think tells us so much about what we need to know, and it is these sea lanes of communication. And if you actually go back even 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, this chart would look roughly the same. You would see the intensity, the red-hot focus in these sea lanes of communication, in these choke points. So our job over the next 3 days is to think about the maritime world, Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, our merchant marine brethren, and how the challenges in the world kind of fit together. I want to start by actually taking you back 100 years ago, almost exactly, to 1916. This is the Battle of Jutland. There's the very proud Admiral Sir John Jellicoe. Terrific book about it, The Rules of the Game, published by the Naval Institute. What we ought to take away from the First World War is this. It was a massive human catastrophe. 11 million people killed in the European theater. At my old headquarters in NATO, this was the battlefield of Verdun, where, again, 100 years ago in 1916, 1 million people were killed or maimed in this single battle over the course of 11 months. The First World War was a collective failure of security in every dimension. And you would think we would have learned something globally out of the First World War. Did we? No. We rolled almost directly into this, the Second World War. This is an iconic photograph from the Battle of Stalingrad. It's the moment where the Russians take control of this utterly destroyed city. And at this moment, 2 million people have been killed or maimed in the last 7 months. So this collapse, this failure of security goes on. And we ought to think about other battles from that war. This, of course, is Midway, Iwo Jima. As we look back on the 20th century, World War I, World War II are the salient events for the people in this hall here. And as security professionals, which is what we all are, we ought to ask ourselves, what went wrong? Why did we fail to deliver security? Why were 60 million people killed in these 2 world wars? My argument is that we tried to create security by building walls. Think about it. Maginot Line, Schlieffen Plan, Iron Curtain, Bamboo Curtain, most iconically, the Berlin Wall. The 20th century was about building security through building walls. Won't work. Will not work in the 21st century. In this world, we need to build bridges, connections, and think about how to move around walls, which I would argue navies, Marine Corps, Coast Guards can be very, very effective at doing. Where did I develop this theory? A lot of it came out of this terrible day. I would imagine a handful of people here shared that day with me in the Pentagon. This was my office, that little red circle. I was a newly selected 1-star in N81. And the irony of that moment has always struck me. Here I was behind every wall you can imagine. I was guarded by the 5 massive walls of the Pentagon, by the strongest military on earth, in the capital of the richest country on the planet. Was I safe behind all those walls? Obviously not. And as I kind of stumbled out that day onto that grassy area in the front of the photograph, tried to help in a small way, watched the real heroes of that day, the first responders, show up. It occurred to me that walls are not going to protect us in this turbulent 21st century. As we surveil the challenges, it's things like this. This is a Taliban justice court in Afghanistan. That's an oxymoron if there ever was one. And at this Taliban justice court, this is a video from it of a man shooting a woman in the back of the head 8 times with an AK-47. The voiceover says, "The court has rendered its judgment. She is guilty of adultery, and you must execute her because you are her husband." This is the kind of violent extremism, much of which comes from the radicalized sliver of Islam that we think of as being somehow a long way away, right? This is Afghanistan, it's in Iraq, it's in Syria. How about Syria, where we see the Islamic State? This young man, 3 weeks ago, executed his mother in front of the post office in Raqqa, Syria. Her crime was trying to convince him to leave the Islamic State. So Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, that's where we think of these kind of terrible things. But how about Europe? This is a small, peaceful European nation, Norway, population 5 million. 3 summers ago, this handsome young man, upper right, his name is Anders Breivik, he blows up the government house. This is like destroying the old executive office building, and kills 7. Then he takes high-powered rifles and goes to a small island off the coast of Oslo where he kills execution-style 70 young people. Now that's a tragedy for any nation. I'd invite you to consider that on a population-adjusted basis, this would be a day in which 3,000 young Americans were killed. And of course, right here in the United States, we have violent extremism, terrible, tragic shooting in Charleston. This kind of violent extremism, some of which comes from radicalized Islam and some of which comes from other issues, is very salient in our world today. And the worst of it, quite obviously, is the Islamic State. They're different because they raise money like a machine, and because they are experts at branding and marketing. 2 years ago, nobody in this room could have picked that black flag out of a lineup. Today, it is the most downloaded image on the World Wide Web. And we see the global reach of the Islamic State expanding. Before the holidays, we saw this Russian jet blow up as it takes off from Egypt. We saw the horrific attacks in Paris. Right alongside it, we saw a horrible market suicide bombing in Lebanon. And here in the United States, San Bernardino. And by the way, for those of you who follow cyber issues, today you see the story breaking of Apple refusing to crack the code on the cell phone of the terrorist shown here in this photograph. This is going to be a major debate in the world of cyber, and it emanates from the kind of activity that the Islamic State is bringing around the world, including most recently in Istanbul, where they blew up a group of tourists standing in front of the Blue Mosque. This began, the Islamic State piece began with the execution, decapitation of this young, brave American journalist. He was killed by Jihad Johnny. It was a string of violence that extended more recently to this young woman, 24 years old, a volunteer working in refugee camps. She's captured by the Islamic State. She is forced to become a sex slave to the leader of the Islamic State. Her name is Kyla Mueller. This is the last letter she wrote to her mother before she died in captivity. And it's not just Kyla Mueller. The Islamic State, in fundraising, is deeply involved in human trafficking, particularly females. Here you see, from the web, price lists. That graph is the price list for a human female. On the left, that's age 1 to 9, $160. Next to it, age 10 to 20, $120, etc. This is real. This is not some kind of depraved film. So this group is fundamentally more dangerous than anything we've seen. And I am surprised that they have not as yet moved into the maritime world and gone after cruise ships, which I think are a logical and lucrative target for them. Anybody remember this from the 1980s? This was Leon Klinghoffer, an American who was executed on a cruise liner by the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And I'm a little surprised we haven't seen more of this. This, of course, is the USS Cole. I think over time we're going to see the Islamic State move into the maritime venue, and therefore we need to think about them in more depth. And worst of all, and I'll close on the Islamic State, is this. They have a plan. It is a well-developed plan to create a caliphate. Look at Spain. I don't think Spain is going to be called Andalus anytime soon. But when an organization raises money very effectively, brands itself perfectly, conducts hyper-violent theatrical performances that grab the attention of the world, and has a plan, that's a very bad combination. So they are an iconic form of this transnational threat that we face today. We also ought to worry about some nations that live outside the norms of international law. One is Iran. Now, we are at a relatively hopeful place in terms of this diplomatic agreement to secure 10 years, we hope, of holiday from their pursuit of nuclear weapons. Whether that agreement pays out or not, I'm skeptical, but I'm willing to wait and see how it comes out. But in the meantime, they sit astride the most important choke point in the world. They are constantly working the diplomatic angles very effectively, and they see themselves in every sense as an imperial power. And as Iran comes off of sanctions and receives tens of billions of dollars, plus even more new business, they will think of themselves as these flags would indicate, as an empire. This is the Persian Empire from 2,000 years ago, when the Persian Empire dominated 80% of the population of the world. These are the battle flags of Cyrus the Great and Xerxes the Magnificent. And they're crafty and innovative. They think about new ways of doing business in our world, and we ought to be very aware of that. And very recently, we had this heart-sickening moment watching our American sailors on their knees in front of Iranian mariners. So whether or not the nuclear deal comes through, we have, in my view, unfinished business with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And others do as well, including our strong Sunni allies in this region, led by Saudi Arabia, who will face Iran in a geopolitical context as well as a religious conflict between Sunnis, Sunni bloc led by Saudi, and a Shia bloc led by Iran. So as we look at our concerns around the world, transnational threats are extraordinary, but we also ought to be thinking about geopolitics and the religious conflict in this part of the world. Having spoken about Iran, I think, however, the most dangerous country in the world is North Korea. Why? Because they have a young, untested, untried, morbidly obese, medically challenged leader with a really bad haircut who already has nuclear weapons. He just detonated one just over a month ago. And newsflash, he has ballistic missiles. And to show us that, he just launched a fairly sophisticated one just over a week ago. So when you put that together, a relatively unstable leader, nuclear weapons, ballistic missile technology, thousands of American troops and families on the Korean Peninsula, I think you have to put Korea at the very top of our list. We also ought to worry about events in Syria. We see refugees moving at speed across this body of water. We always think about the South China Sea, and we should, as an area of tension. We ought to recognize the Eastern Mediterranean is increasingly at a higher level of tension than the South China Sea. These refugee waves are quite extraordinary. We're up to 1,200,000 over the last 14 months. We're on track to hit 2 million by the end of the year. And the Europeans are increasingly overwhelmed, particularly at point of entry, in Greece, in Italy, through the Balkans. Even Germany, Austria, Sweden, nations with real capability and a culture of welcoming refugees and even migrants are increasingly pushing back. So those are some national issues we should worry about, and I'll put one back on your radar that we haven't thought about so much lately, and it's Ukraine. Now this is a very calm-looking, typical map of Ukraine. Here's what it looks like on the ground. Yesterday, there were dozens and dozens of artillery strikes exchanged between the Ukrainian forces and the rebels in Donbass. And our challenge is that we have been unable to conquer the strategic terrain in Ukraine, and it's not on that map. The strategic terrain is right there. It's the mind of Vladimir Putin, who continues to press outside the borders of Russia, and this annexation of Crimea is a striking example of him as a risk taker. So that part of our worry ought to include this, which is hybrid warfare, this mix of little green men, unmarked uniforms, cyber, propaganda, information warfare. It's been used very effectively in Ukraine, and I think we have not seen the last of it. We ought to worry about the ice caps in the north, which are melting. We could have a debate about why and how fast and the science behind it, but as a mariner, it's simply a fact that these ice caps are shrinking. It'll open a geopolitical competition in the north. We're going to see increasingly conflict, tension between Russia and the NATO nations that are on the front porch up there. What else should we be concerned about? I would put this on the chart. This is narcotics. Everybody here can recognize this crop, right? This is poppies, exactly. Makes heroin, opium, moves across from Afghanistan through the Balkans into Europe, here to the United States, to New England, where we have a significant heroin epidemic. 90% of the world's heroin comes from Afghanistan, by the way. And I want to just kind of park the moral question to the side about whether people ought to use drugs or not, personal choice or not, legalization. Those are vibrant debates we should have. But as security professionals, what we ought to be thinking about is the fact that the money from this undermines fragile democracies and creates real pressure on nations throughout the world, to include here in the Americas the movement of cocaine, different drug. This is actually a pretty hopeful picture. This is a Coast Guard detachment operating from a Navy ship that is busting a drug runner. The bad news is the drug runner is the one on the bottom. It's the high-tech, semi-submersible, looks like Batman's submarine. When we caught it, and there, of course, is a Navy destroyer just out of the picture. When we caught it, it had 10 tons of cocaine in it. Street value, $150 million. So here are the numbers. That's 10 tons of cocaine. To buy it in Colombia is $1 million. To build this craft is $1 million. To do the bribes and the logistics is $1 million. That's $3 million in. Street value, $150 million out. A lot of business people here in the audience. That's margin. That's profit. If you went to business school, that's EBITDA. And where does that money go? It is used to finance violent extremism and to move more product, undermining all of our societies. We also ought to worry a bit about pirates. That has been diminished over the last couple of years due to the work of a lot of fleets and a lot of mariners in the civilian side. We also ought to think more broadly about Asia than just North Korea. We see a lot bubbling in Asia. We see the rise of China. We see just yesterday's news about the emplacement of missiles on Woody Island, effectively in the center of the South China Sea. This is where our good friend Admiral Harry Harris recently said the Chinese are building the Great Wall of Sand. Exactly. And I can tell you, as an international lawyer, that's what my PhD is in, this is a preposterous claim. But the Chinese would say historically they should dominate the South China Sea. That's roughly the same as Mexico saying they should own the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. It is unsupportable in international law, and it will lead to conflict not just between the United States and China, but potentially other Asian partners. This is Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan. He's controversially here visiting the Yasukuni War Shrine in Japan, but it is indicative of a Japanese approach which is more forward-leaning and more assertive. So watch that bubbling cauldron in the South China Sea and to the north in Northeast Asia as well. We also ought to worry about Mother Nature, about pandemics. This is the Ebola virus and the Zika virus. But having said all that and walked you through those challenges, people would ask me when I was the NATO commander, what keeps you awake at night? Is it Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, the Balkans, piracy? Nope. This is what kept me awake at night and where I spend more of my own personal time thinking and writing and speaking today, and it's cyber. These are the flags of Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and the Republic of Georgia. What do they have in common? All have undergone a cyber attack in the last 6 years. Georgia will go down in military history as the first nation to be subject to a kinetic attack, bombs, rockets, missiles, and a cyber attack at the same time. We're going to see more of it, and this is our most vulnerable point, is our electric grid. Why? Because it's a patchwork. It's not sophisticated in any sense. If you think about it, think about two great inventors. Alexander Graham Bell, he invented the telephone. If he came back and he looked at that supercomputer you're carrying in your pocket, your iPhone, he couldn't comprehend it. He couldn't understand the technology of it. Thomas Alva Edison harnessed electricity, right? If you brought him back today and showed him the electric grid, he'd say, I can do that. Let me kind of help you get that organized. We have not made the technological progress, and therefore our electric grid is extremely vulnerable as we go forward. Our financial institutions are vulnerable. JP Morgan Chase, 2 summers ago, 87 million accounts accessed. We'll see more of this kind of transnational, opportunistic attack. This was North Korea, that's their flag, attacking Sony Pictures, an American filmmaking corporation, because of this movie, The Interview. This is actually a terrible movie. I don't know if anyone actually watched the whole movie. It's about the young leader in North Korea, and it mocks him, and therefore the North Koreans attack Sony Pictures. $300 million worth of damage to Sony. This is a significant part of state-on-state force today. And lastly, in the world of cyber, it gets personal. This is Jennifer Lawrence, beautiful young Academy Award-winning actress. You've seen her in The Hunger Games, among other films. About 1.5 years ago, Ms. Lawrence took some, shall we say, intimate photographs of herself intended for her significant other. She posted them in a password-protected account in the cloud. Predictably, perhaps, it was hacked, And all of those photographs of her in very intimate settings, intended for her significant other, two consenting adults, no problem, unfortunately for her, hacked all over the internet. My point is, cyber goes from the highest level of our national concerns, our national security, to our finances, to our credit cards, to our medical records, all the way to the most personal aspects of our lives. So cyber, I think, is where we see the greatest mismatch between level of threat and level of preparation. We are not well prepared for that world. Lastly, we have economic challenges. This is the euro, which I think we're about to see yet another round of pressure upon it as the Greeks continue to fail, and I'm Greek American, to solve significant problems there. And what's our problem here in the United States? Political gridlock. Our political parties, our branches of government, we're about to have an epic conflict about the Supreme Court. We can't seem to find our way to coherently build bridges and work together. And all of what I've spoken of this morning leads to this, a sense that somehow the world is too difficult, too complicated, too horrible, and can't we just wall it off? Can we build a wall? Can we isolate ourselves? It will not work in the 21st century. So right about now, you ought to say, well, Admiral, that's quite a portrait of a very turbulent world. What do you think? What can we do about it? What are the opportunities to create security? I'll start with this. We ought to listen more. We, our nation, our allies, ourselves individually, the organizations we lead, we should spend a little more time listening and understanding the other person, the other organization, the other nation. We should spend a little more time before we leap into action. This, by the way, is not Photoshop. This is an actual early air defense system. It's quite innovative for its time, 1920s. The man is listening for incoming aircraft. I think this system is actually still in place in Belgium in the NATO system. When I showed this in Germany a few years ago, where, as you may know, the Germans are very exercised about American surveillance, I had a German ask me, in all seriousness, is this, Admiral, an early NSA listening device of some kind? No, this is metaphor. We should all listen more. We should also do exactly what you're doing here over the next 3 days. Many of you will recognize the Naval War College. It is a place where the armed forces, particularly the Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, our fellow services, send our young men and women, officers, senior enlisted, to build intellectual capital, to stop, to listen, to think, to read, maybe to write and publish. There's real value in this part of the equation in creating security. And we ought to hold on to our values. So often, these are the first things we want to jettison, like ballast to get ourselves further into space. Who are these people? This is Aristotle, Locke, Voltaire, Cicero, Washington. These values, liberty, democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of education, freedom of assembly, gender equality, racial equality, we execute them imperfectly. But they're the right values, and they have to be part of how we create security. We should also read more. And I know we're all reading our emails, and we're reading our inboxes, and we're doing our work reading, but I would make the case that we ought to read a little more broadly. So I'm going to say we ought to read some novels, because in fiction, you can step into another world. You can step into another person's life. Admiral Malloy this morning was talking about reading One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, a marvelous novel by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. It is a vision. He was using it to talk about how hard life is in the Pentagon. It's like being in a gulag in Russia. Okay. Joe, I'm going to say it's also a wonderful way to understand the Russian psychology. And if you think the Russians are going to crack under Western sanctions, you should go back and read One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. If you want to understand the young leader in North Korea, you should read The Orphan Master's Son, a brilliant novel that won the National Book Award about life in the most dystopian society possibly in the history of the world. That's a high bar to get over. If you want to understand what's happening just south of here in northern Mexico, read The Cartel by Don Winslow. It just came out. It is the intertwining of the families, the governments, the police forces, and the cartels in northern Mexico that create extraordinary violence within a 15-minute drive of here. So read and think about not only traditional wonderful reading, but also how novels can help you think about other worlds. And there are some terrific maritime books to read as well. If you haven't read The Bedford Incident in a few years or seen that movie, I highly recommend it. Are we headed back to another Cold War? If we are, you're going to want to reread The Bedford Incident about the collision of an American destroyer and a Russian submarine off the coast of Greenland at the height of the Cold War. We should also do more of this. Think about languages. To know another language is to know another life. Yet only 8% of the people in the Department of Defense speak a second language. That's the Rosetta Stone. This is a photograph of a young Canadian corporal who's taught himself Pashtun. That ability to communicate is absolutely crucial. Other opportunities. Here's the United States. I would argue our nation remains an extraordinary opportunity. Now, I'm not a triumphalist. I don't believe the United States should be the world's policeman, but we bring great resources to the table. Look at this photograph, upper left. That's the G20. Those are the heads of the 20 largest economies in the world. Regardless of how you feel about our current president or the previous president or our next president, look at that photograph. When the President of the United States speaks, other nations turn and listen. That's real political capital if you choose to exercise it. Upper right, our economy, not perfect. We have debt overhang. We have problems with deficits annually. We have difficulties with our national debt, obviously. But I'd take our hand of cards over any other large economy in the world. Bottom right, I don't need to tell this audience how profoundly capable the armed forces are of this nation. And bottom left, we are still a young nation. Our demographics work in our favor, and immigration strengthens us. And what's that in the center? That's a fracking tower, folks. Now, we still have to work our way through some aspects of fracking and the market as oil prices go down, more complicated. But over time, if we solve the environmental piece, I am convinced the United States is on a trajectory for a period of energy independence because of this. So when you take all that together, it's a very rich basket. So the question is, who are our allies? Who should we be working with? Everybody here will immediately say NATO, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. We know who our allies are, right? I would argue we ought to think more about this nation, about India. India is, in my view, going to be the most determinative rising power of the 21st century, not China. China will be important, obviously, but over time, India, which will be a larger nation than China in population in about 15 to 20 years, has English as a backbone, has strong connectivity to Western economies, and above all is a democracy, which is the safety valve that allows you to peacefully change governments. India will be a very important partner for the United States, and perhaps someday in this century, an ally of the United States. NATO matters, 28 nations, 52% of the world's GDP, richest alliance in history. And it is an alliance. An attack on one is regarded as an attack on all. But it's not just alliances that matter. It is also coalitions. This is the Counter-Piracy Coalition, which has done extraordinary work off the coast of East Africa. This is a French Special Forces detachment capturing pirates. They've landed from an Italian helicopter, refueled from a Danish frigate, with overhead information provided by the United States and our surveillance systems in cooperation with the Russian Federation, with the government of India. This coalition is a good example of building bridges to create security, just like alliances do. Do we still need a traditional military? Absolutely. Do we need these kind of important high-tech systems? We do. I would argue, however, that there are real values on the maritime side that this 21st century and all that I've talked about will imply. Why? Because maritime forces, particularly when supported by our Coast Guard and our Marine Corps, taken together, we go around walls. That's who we are and what we do. So I think there will be a premium on maritime, air, and Marine Corps light ground type systems. And I think also we don't have enough. This is the chart that Admiral Daly sends me every couple of days when it comes out. It's where's the fleet? Where are the carriers? Where are the ARGs? We are going to face this challenge of numbers going forward in this very turbulent world. But I'll give you three other things that are going to change. Now this, by the way, is another really bad movie. It's a terrific novel. If you have never read the novel Ender's Game, read it. What is this about? It's a cyber war. It's about very young, heroic men and women who defend their nation in the cybersphere. I think it's time to start thinking seriously about a cyber force. We have an Army, a Navy, a Marine Corps, an Air Force, Coast Guard, terrific. 100 years ago, by the way, did we have an Air Force? No. Why not? Because we didn't have airplanes, basically. We didn't fly them for significant military purpose. Today, of course, we have an Air Force. I think we'll look back in 50 years, maybe in 20 years, we'll look back and say, what were we thinking in 2016 that we didn't have a cyber force? Because this will be a venue of real conflict going forward. So I think our armed forces will have much more of a cyber component, more of an unmanned component for all the reasons that I don't need to unpackage for an audience like this, and special forces. Cyber, unmanned special forces. That is a powerful triad. We talk a lot about the nuclear triad. We're in the process of funding the vital leg of it, in my view, the most vital leg, the Ohio class. But this is the triad that we will use, hopefully, much, much more than we will use the strategic triad. Cyber, unmanned, special forces. This, by the way, is Michael Murphy, who is the subject of a very good movie, Lone Survivor, which many of you will have seen. This is the real Michael Murphy. He died in Afghanistan in 2008, where he won the Medal of Honor. Today, his spirit sails proudly as that Arleigh Burke destroyer. We will also see shipping lanes become increasingly important as energy flows in different ways. These are LNG tankers. Those are the flags of the Baltic states. And we will also, as I wrap up here, need to think about soft power as well as the hard power I've just described. We need to think about things like our hospital ships. This is Comfort, doing a cruise. Those are the flags of Latin America and the Caribbean. I was proud to sail that ship a couple of times as the Southcom commander. And when a ship like this pulls into port and does 400,000 patient treatments over a 6-month cruise, that creates real security for us, as well as the kind of combat capability we talked about earlier. And I'll give you another example of that soft power. This is literacy training in Afghanistan. These are Afghan police and soldiers who are learning to read. Their demographic never learned to read because the Taliban withheld education from them. We're teaching them to read. We've taught 800,000 young Afghans to read and write. This is a bridge, and the most important bridge I can think of, the bridge to civilization. We also ought to think about this, the role of women, and how we can further integrate them into our societies, obviously, but also into our armed forces. This is untapped potential and capability, and it's part of building bridges as well. Now you're looking at that thinking, why is there a picture of Hugh Jackman here? And the answer is because my wife says every good presentation has a picture of Hugh Jackman in it somewhere. There he is. I put it here to remind us, amidst all our excitement about information and cyber and all the things I've talked about, high-tech military equipment represented so well by the contractors in their booths out here, bio is going to change our world in ways we don't even begin to imagine as yet. We are just now obtaining the ability to edit the human genome through tools like CRISPR. This will allow us not only to sequence the human genome, that's the top photograph, but deeply improve human performance, human life expectancy. This is not science fiction. Cover of Time magazine, this baby could live to be 142 years old. That's not Isaac Asimov's novels. This is real science beginning to break through those glass ceilings. Bio will change almost everything in our lives over the next 20 or 30 years. And then I'll conclude with this one. What are these? Now you're looking at that thinking, okay, retired SWO, these are probably sea lanes of communication. Or maybe they're fiber optic cables under the ocean, like I wrote about in Signal magazine for AFCEA. Or maybe these are air traffic lanes, ACAO routes. Nope. This is the world according to Facebook. The brighter the white, the higher the concentration of Facebook users. 1.5 billion people are on Facebook today. It is the biggest bridge ever built. It's connecting a population greater than the largest nation on earth, China, 1.2 and a half billion, 1.5 billion on Facebook. Why is this important? Because of two things. One is the bad news. This is also a photograph of the command and control network of the Islamic State. They are recruiting, proselytizing, moving recruits, and conducting operations on the social networks. That's the bad news. The good news is this is where we have the opportunity to move our messages, democracy, liberty, freedom, all the things we value. We must get into this world, and we must do a better job of it. That is the bridge, and maybe the most important bridge we can build for our security. So I'll wrap up now. You knew with a surface warfare officer you would not get out of this hall alive without looking at a picture of a Tomahawk missile launching from an Aegis cruiser. There it is. I put this here because I've spent a lot of time this morning talking about what might be called soft power, right? Reading, listening, literacy training, hospital ships, role of women, our values. That's all soft power. I would not want anyone to leave here today with the slightest shred of doubt about my view that we need hard power. Soft power without the ability to apply hard power is no power. You need both. You need this, a rheostat. Because there are times when you need hard power, like we do today against psychopathic thugs like the Islamic State. But the long game is on the soft power side. It is the education. It's building a global economy. It's moving our value systems. It's teaching people to read. That's what creates security in the long game. Taken together, soft power and hard power, that's smart power. And I think that's the most profound approach we can take to create security. So last slide. Wikipedia. This is the symbol of Wikipedia. It's the largest body of knowledge ever assembled. It is greater than the library, the ancient Library of Alexandria, greater than the Library of Congress, bigger than Harvard's Widener Library, vastly enormous. Every day, tens of thousands of people input to it, and every day millions of people draw that knowledge out. It is the perfect symbol of the fact that no one of us is as smart as all of us thinking together. No one person, no one organization, no one nation, no one alliance, no one of us is as good as all of us working and thinking together. The vision statement of Wikipedia, upon which I will close this small talk, is quite simple. The vision statement is a world in which every human being can freely share in the sum of all knowledge. A world in which every human being can freely share in the sum of all knowledge. My thesis for us is that by collaboration, by building bridges, by smart power, hard and soft together, by all of those things, we can create the sum of all security in the 21st century. Thank you very much. A pleasure to be with you. Thank you. I'd be happy to take a few questions or comments. If anyone would like to stand up, you can walk to a couple of mics here. And I think I see someone moving toward a mic right now. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hope Sec with military.com.
Thanks.
I was just hoping you could expand on what our vulnerabilities are with regards to cruisers. If, as you're saying, we're expecting to see the Islamic State break into the maritime domain, what should we be doing? Where are we vulnerable?
On our ships, you mean? Or, okay. So I think that in terms of the Islamic State, we have cyber vulnerabilities, which are increasing. We have an organization that has demonstrated they are highly innovative, and I don't rule out a Cole-like event. I think we see an organization that also would love to capture an American sailor or two. So I think of our crews as they go ashore being extremely vulnerable in small groups. And fourthly, I think that the Islamic State would love the symbolic aspect of going after a ship at sea. And it's counterintuitive, but a ship, in my view, is at its most vulnerable, not when it's alongside a pier, and not when it's on the open ocean, but it is as it is getting underway and going out to sea. I think that, if I were an Islamic State planner, that's the phase I would be looking at. Thanks.
Admiral Mark Morris with the Talmadge Group. This week in Forsyth County, Georgia, at South Forsyth High School, there will be a debate going on, which my daughter Natalie will be leading.
Wonderful.
And it is in the role of women working in special operations forces in those arenas. And I was just curious, if you were there this week, what would you offer as a commander in terms of opinions or thoughts on that
Sure.
subject?
20 years ago, I was the captain of USS Barry, and we were the first warship, combatant, I should say, destroyer, to bring women into the crew. And we spent a year getting ready for that, you know, my all-male crew. And we did workshops, and I walked around and talked to every work center in the ship, and we spent a lot of time thinking about the role of women. And then we did a change out where 15% of the crew left, and in came 15% new. In fact, I just saw one of the junior officers who was on that ship, retired Commander Julie Rosati. And I'll tell you this, within 3 weeks after the women got aboard, we all shrugged our shoulders and said, what was that all about? What was the big deal? And I think in special forces, at the end of the day, if women can meet the standards, just like they met the standards on the Berry, if they can meet the far higher standards of special operations, I think they should be part of that community. And I don't think that's a particularly complicated set of decisions. Thanks. Yes, sir.
Sir, good morning. Jeff Spites with Raytheon.
Hi, Jeff.
Thank you for your time, and I appreciate your remarks. I'm interested in what is it like when you give that presentation to the kids at Tufts? How do they respond? How do they challenge you? Is there more skepticism, or is there more a common denominator level of thought as perhaps we have in this auditorium? Thank you.
Thank you. I think the students that I'm blessed to have at the Fletcher School are average age 28, half men, half women, half U.S., half international. So I have 80 countries represented at the Fletcher School on a daily basis. So do they push back? You bet. When I've got an audience with 3 Russians and 11 Chinese and 4 Pakistanis, they push back in a big way on the role of the United States. They see us as too big, too muscular, too engaged. On the other hand, our European allies, because I have Germans and Italians and French and Estonians and Latvians, they push back because we're not sufficiently engaged in their view. We're not on the edge and pushing forward. Our students from the Arab world say, you, the United States, your 2 invasions have been the source of a great deal of the discontent. My American students will engage them and argue with them. I find that that spectrum of internationalism is one of the reasons I love my current job. The point is that we have to spend a lot of time in dialogue and discussion, and as we talked about in this presentation, putting yourself in the place of the other. And all of these are hard, complicated issues. But the more we listen, put ourselves in the shoes of the other, think about what we want to do, articulate it, the better the chance of success. Thanks for asking that. We have time for one more, and it's going to go to the Marine right here.
Thank you, Admiral. Sergeant Edon from the Marine Corps Information Operations Center.
Hi.
I see as we move into this 3rd offset, we have a very good capability to develop capabilities, but we don't have the human domain concept behind it. With our 1st offset, we had our nuclear deterrence and building that up, but we really had game theory to prevent us from killing each other. And then with our second offset, we had precision-guided weapons,
Right.
But then we had network-centric warfare to execute it. With this new capability, this Phase 3 capability, really, we're not backing that up with some sort of concept that shows our adversaries that we're willing to deter them or compel them from doing their actions. Our adversaries focus most of their efforts in Phase 0, changing the facts on the ground in the South China Sea, changing the facts on the ground in the Ukraine.
That's a great summary.
Yes, sir.
What's the question?
I think the solution is to go back to Frank Wisner's, mighty Vorlitzer. We have to be willing to believe that we can change and influence everyone, and that we don't need to just accept the allies that we have and accept the adversaries that we have, that we can develop this world system to the direction that we need to go.
And
but I don't believe we have the political will.
I got it. And the question is?
Do we have the political will to start shaping the environment?
Yes. First of all, I'm always happy to see Marines in the audience and everywhere because I grew up in the Marine Corps. I went to Quantico High School. My dad was a Marine colonel. So thanks for a great question and a wonderful disquisition on the flow of the offset world. I would say what we need to think about is the 4th offset. And I hate the term, the 2nd, the 1st. It's sort of impenetrable dialogue. But what I mean by that is the human terrain and the bioterrain that I've talked about here. Until we find the way to move into these social networks, to tap the coming revolution in biology, and to recognize the human dimension that underpins all of this glittering technology, we will not achieve real security for our nation. So I'm going to close and pick up a note there, which is simply this. A lot of times these days people say to me, thank you for your service, and I appreciate that greatly. And how many veterans are here, by the way? An awful lot, I would say. Terrific. Thank you for your service. But I want to make a point for others here, which is that many of you are in the defense industry. You're here because you're representing superb, incredible corporations that are putting all this together. If you are part of that, you are serving as well. You are serving your country. You are part of the defense of this country. And events like this that bring together active duty, veterans, and our defense industry are events of service. And I'm proud to be here with every one of you. Thank you for your service. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, Pete.
One quick present.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
Admiral Stavridis, thank you very much for your thoughtful and thought-provoking remarks. And we've got a Naval Institute press book, Toward a New Maritime Strategy by Peter Haynes with an FCA bookmark. And we thank you very much.
Thanks, Pete. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Thanks, everybody.